Hi, my name's Larry Genie. I taught physics at Evanston High School for 23 years and a bunch of other places before that. I retired in 2010, and while I was a teacher, I developed a whole approach that enables students to take ownership of their own learning, make more decisions in the classroom. And I found that, and I was teaching honors physics along with other classes, and so I had classrooms filled with the same kind of students that I've been hearing you have in this building who really are driven by grades. They really want to get the grade point so their class rank will be good enough to get into the college so they can get the job they want, and it's out there. It's all out there. And the issue of learning is not what drives the train. Actually, let's just stop and think for a second. I'd like you to do a little exercise. Think about your purpose when you walk into a room, in a classroom. If you had to shrink it down to one sentence, here's what I'm here for. This is what my job is. When I walk in the room, here's my purpose. Think about that for a second. We'll do a little contrast. Anybody got a thought? Can you do it in one sentence? Something to do with getting them to learn probably was in there. Now put yourself in the mind of one of your really successful, driven students and think about when they walk in the room, what's their purpose? What are they trying to accomplish? Get an A, right? You have two very different reasons for being in the room. And because you don't share a belief about what your purpose is, you're not really working together. You have to find a common purpose that they believe in and you do too. And so my job today is to give you a sense of that's what the approach that I developed while I was a teacher is really all about, is to create a sense of a communal purpose that has to do with learning and personal growth and get the grades out of the picture. And I can promise you that even with the same kinds of students that you've got, it is in fact doable. I had no points in my classroom. I had almost no conversations with students where we were fighting about a grade. It can be done. But it means changing beliefs, theirs and yours, and that's not so easy. That turns out to be a challenge because it has to do with who we are as people, why we do this job, and you gotta challenge yourself a little bit. So what I'm going to do today is just give you a very quick overview of this idea, the driving philosophy, and then give you a list of possible strategies and dive into one or two of them as time permits and show you some examples of things so you get a better sense of what this is about. And then I'll give you a massive amount of resources that you can dive into on your own, online. Okay? So let me tell you what I think the source of the problem is. Way down deep. So, yeah, the manual on-off button. There it is. So, I don't know, those of you who are far away, you can see this. So this is a website that I created. Since 2010 when I retired, I've been working as an educational consultant. And I've been going into different schools, adapting the ideas that I developed as a physics teacher to teachers of every discipline. Because if you're a Spanish teacher or even a biology teacher, your classroom is different than a physics teacher's. So let me just show you what I've got, and then we'll dive into some. Hello. There we go. Okay, so I've got, there are actually 2 books in this website, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as time permits. I got a blog, blah, blah, blah. But the thing that I want to focus on right now is a collection of tools that I have collected from all the people that I started with, but then over the past 7 years I've been working with a lot of teachers in every discipline And every time they develop something, I say, can I use this? And they say yes. Can I share this? And they say yes. And I've been collecting a library of materials from every discipline that are adaptations of the basic idea for these teachers. So tools for teachers. And I want to start with the classroom culture, which is one of the foundational ideas here, is that you have to shift the culture in the room, because that's where our beliefs come from, is the culture we live in. So let me show you what I think the source of the problem is. It's what I call the curriculum transfer model. See if this makes sense to you. Many of us were taught in schools, and our students are used to this idea that there's a simple purpose for being in school. There's this curriculum that is passed through a teacher to the students. And our job is to get this to happen as effectively as possible. Get as much of that into that as we can in the limited amount of time we've got. This thing has a bunch of problems built into it. One of them is that look at the role of the student. They're, by design, passive recipients of information. And that lends itself to a certain pointlessness from their point of view. If you're loading stuff that you know is important, Newton's third law is really important, right? But they may not think so. And if they're on the receiving end of Newton's third law and they don't really care about Newton's third law and don't see how it connects to their lives, then the purpose of school becomes less and less meaningful to them. And as a result, they start to look for what does make sense. And what does make sense is, when I get out of here, I'm going to college, for most of your students. And I want that to be this kind of college. And that means I have to get good grades. And so this drives the whole thing. It drives what I call doing school. Cramming for a test, regurgitating on the test, forgetting the stuff. And then the next unit, you cram for the test, you regurgitate on the test, you forget the stuff. And when you're all done, you haven't got much. That is, in fact, meaningless activity. And that's a big part of what their lives are, because this is what they think we're doing. So we have to shift their belief, and ours, by the way, about what we're here for. So that brings me to a different model, a model based on student agency, and one in which we acknowledge that who they become as people in the room is at least as important as what the content that they're absorbing. When they leave this place, if we're really here to prepare them for life, which I think is the only reasonable goal for building a school, they need to know how to be self-directed, they need to know how to be metacognitive, they need to know how to work with other people, they need to be able to lean into a problem, take risks, make mistakes, learn from the mistakes. They need to know how to learn from mistakes. If their whole purpose in school is to avoid making mistakes, they don't learn that skill. But in life, that's a really important skill, right? So if we have a system like this, a model like this, where there's a teacher and a bunch of students and the curriculum is the thing that we're talking about while we're doing the real work of causing them to grow to their potential, causing them to learn all of these skills, to adopt the growth mindset. I know you guys have been talking a lot about that. That's implicit in this, is they internalize the attributes of success. They internalize these personality traits that will allow them to be successful in school and in life. And it's in this model that becomes much more likely because they're very active participants in education, right? So what does that actually look like in a classroom? How do you do this? How do you get the shift from here's the curriculum, do it, get it, to this? Well, there's a whole system behind this that I developed and I've been developing for the last 7 years with lots and lots of teachers. And What I want to do is show you a series of strategies, some of which I'm sure you're already doing, but without changing the culture, any strategy doesn't work as well, if at all. The culture is what drives the thing. If everyone in the room believes that our purpose, our common purpose, teacher, every student, is for every one of us to grow as much as possible and to learn as much as possible, and we're all in on that, think about the students you've got who are grade grubbing and who are working for what's clearly this strange motivation. And then think about them doing something like being on the basketball team or building a set for a stage show, production, or anything that they do that's not academic, and get out of the way, right? I mean, they have massive amounts of energy and enthusiasm, which they don't all that often bring into the classroom because in those activities, they have a common purpose that they can believe in. And they don't have that in most classrooms. So we have to cultivate that. I'm not going to talk about how to do that, how to build that culture, because that's a big deal. But in the books that are in this thing, I have 3 chapters dedicated to that. And if you want to find out more at the end, I'll give you more information about that. It's a process. I wouldn't start talking about physics till the second week of school, because I'd spend the first week talking about what school is for, and what do you believe, and what do I believe, and how can we get something formed that will that we can all believe in. And after investing a week into that, we could start doing some of these techniques that I'm going to show you. Okay, so let me untitle. I just made this morning, actually. Let's get rid of that thing. Okay, so is that big enough? Can you read that? Yeah? You guys are better than mine. So culture is the big one. I can't talk about that because that's a complex thing, and it requires some real thought about how to adapt certain ideas to your classroom. Separating feedback from grades, on the other hand, is something anybody can do at any time. We use grades for a bunch of purposes, partly to motivate, because we know that's what they're looking for, but also to give them feedback about how well they're doing, how well they understand, and so forth. But if you separate these two things and you start giving lots and lots and lots of feedback to them about whether they're understanding something or not, first of all, you're shifting your gaze towards learning. And secondly, you're detaching the value of grades, which warps everything, and giving them information about what to do next to master the material. So imagine giving your students a quiz and having them grade it, by which I mean figure out which things they got wrong. And then having some activity, a series of activities where they can spread out, and the people who got this wrong would do that, and the people who got this wrong would do that. And there's no grade to any of this. And they choose what they're going to do. Ungraded feedback. There's lots and lots of forms that can take, but you get the idea. Give them information about what they have to do so they can start to steer their own learning. And it's about learning. It's not about whether they got 11 points or 14 points. Student self-evaluation, which I am going to dive into and show you some practical hands-on stuff, is huge. If they're grading themselves and you teach them how to do that honestly and accurately, first of all, they're becoming more metacognitive in the process. They are paying attention to whether they've excelled at something or not without you telling them. And secondly, you get out of the point distribution business. So at the end of a marking period, for instance, if they've been grading themselves a lot, how can they argue with you about grades? They created the grades. So there's lots of ways to do this. Formative assessments, I'm sure many of you are doing, if not all of you. But if you create a structure in which you start to shift, it's part of the cultural thing. If you start to shift what the tests are for, they think if they've crammed for a test and done well on the test, that they were successful on the test, even if they've forgotten all the material a week later. That's success. It's not success for you, but it is for them. Right? So if you can shift the culture so that the test taking is feedback about what you have mastered and what you don't know yet, and then there's a process that they absolutely expect to do. If I didn't do well on this test, then I need to do it, and the test directs them to what they need to do next, then the issue about how many points they got becomes less important, because there's a process by which A, they'll get more points, but B, they'll learn what they didn't learn the first time. But then people are doing different things at the same time, so you really have to start to differentiate, and some people are working on stuff from last unit, and some are working on this unit, and you have to have a structure for that, which is also in here. Replacing point-based grades. Coming up with a method whereby it's more like a box score. I'm doing pretty well at this, I'm doing very well at that, and it isn't digital. It isn't, a percent. Becoming intentionally vague about grades. I know the computer is driving it to the second decimal point. But that's wildly unrealistic. Think about learning and then think about numbers. They are not connected. We've made that, we've convinced ourselves, and we were training parents, by the way. Several people have talked about parents and the fights you get into. We're training them that what really matters is whether the kid's homework grade is 87% or 84%. We're training them actively all the time. We got to get out of that business. We should be training them to care about whether their kid is self-directed or not, or whether their kid is creative or not, or whether their kid is metacognitive or honest. Okay, and so there's a whole thing about that. There's a chapter on grades that explains a lot of this stuff. And another thing that I did that is not hard to do is grade conferences. At the end of a marking period, you sit down, they show you all your work, we talk about what strengths you've done, what you've done well, what you haven't, and we come up with a grade. Not based on the points you've accumulated, but on how well you've done in this and that and that and that. And then we talk about it. We come up with what a grade ought to be and a plan for what to do next. And then in the course of the year, you have these conversations periodically where they're course correcting and they're thinking, I'm procrastinating. I have to deal with procrastination. That'll help my grade. And you start to get personal about what the grade actually means. Okay? So let me show you some examples. Well, first of all, let me stop. Anybody got any questions at this point? I can dive into some examples of structures, but at this point, you may be thinking, this doesn't seem realistic, not with my kids. Anybody want to talk about this? Because I'll just keep talking, but I know you just sat through a lot. Yes, ma'am.
Does anyone ever fail?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I just question sitting down with a kid and ever being able to discuss what they've done and saying that they've failed at trying to learn the material.
Sure.
How does that conversation,
then you talk
nothing, so you just get an F, or
well, if you have
nothing to show of your growth.
Actually, I wasn't going to do this one, but let me go back to. I'll show you the form that I used for grades. Let me see. Here's an example of self-evaluation that'll get to your question. So this is. Part of the grade that I would give students was based on what I call personal outcomes. How well did you participate? How self-directed were you? How did you manage your time and your materials? Did you take personal responsibility for the good of the group? Did you contribute something to how this functions? Those are the things I chose. And then I would have them answer a few questions for each one and say, did you contribute to a positive academic atmosphere? 5 is always, consistently, and 1 is never. And then they would evaluate how well they did these attributes that I valued. Yours might be wildly different than mine, but you can make this anything you want it to be. And they would come up with a personal outcomes grade for themselves. Here's how well I did the job of being a student in a community of learners. That, to my mind, is an important piece of information about who they are. So let me show you how that would all get put together. So here's how I would do grades at the end of the quarter. Journal work, and I'll show you. So they did all their work in a journal for me. All the labs, all the homework readings, all the problem sets, all of it would go into a journal. And they would be evaluating their journal, and I'll show you that in a second too, throughout the year. So this grade would be entirely student generated. They're evaluating how well they're doing the work. It's not how well they mastered it, but how well did they do the process of doing the work. That's student generated. It's 40% of the grade for me. Evidence of learning, tests, test resubmittals, the formative stuff, retests of all kinds, learning summaries, whatever it was that accumulated an assessment of how well you understand this material. How well do you get this? And then 20%, which you may think is high, I don't think is high, is how well did you do in the personal outcomes? How much did you grow as a human being? How much did you become a member of a community of learners? And they would put down what they thought, and I would put down what I thought. And then we'd have a conversation. And they'd have all their material in front of them, and we could look at their journal, and we could look at all their tests and so forth. And they would come up with a grade for themselves for the quarter before I'd meet with them, and I would too, and then we'd sit down and talk about if there's a difference, why. And then I would put that grade in the computer. This is not objective. Grades shouldn't be objective. Because learning isn't objective. The amount of learning a person does, or the amount of personal growth a person does, is not a number. It can't possibly be a number. It's a lie that we make it into a number. It doesn't make any sense. Uh-oh. Yes, ma'am.
What do you do when your perception of the student's work is radically different from their own?
That's a great question. Did you hear that? When the student disagrees with me, that lends itself to the best conversation of the year. That's where you get honest. And if a kid's trying to manipulate you, I need an A. Have any of you been told that? I need an A, right? If they're dishonest or they're manipulative, that's the conversation. Oh, so you want to game me. But we're not here to do that anymore. That's not our purpose in this room. Our purpose is to see, are you learning? Are you growing? And that's what I think we should be talking about. So if you're trying to win a legalistic negotiation with me, I'm not playing that game. And if you're dishonest with me, you can't play. If there's an honest disagreement, then you dive into what that's about. Those are the most meaningful conversations I ever had with students. The ones that made the most difference in their lives were based on especially about the personal outcomes. If they think they're doing and I think they're doing that, and we have a real big gap between them, that's what drives the conversation. And that may be the most important thing that happens to them all year.
When do you actually have these conversations?
Before I have to put a grade in the computer.
But I mean, like during class time?
Yes, during class time, sometimes outside of class time if possible, you work it. And in the chapter on grades, I've got a whole section on the practical problems of doing this kind of grade conference, and all the different things you can do to try to carve out time. I showed almost no movies, but if I had a great movie that I wanted to show, it would be during grade conferences, and I'd pull people aside while they're doing their grade, So, but you got to work that problem. Myself, spending 3 or 4 days doing this instead of instruction, way worth it.
So I'm sure you're fully aware that we have the online grade programs, and we have parents checking that. So if you were to come back to Glenbrook South or Glenbrook North and work under this regime, how often would you input grades?
As rarely as I could get away with. You live in a world in which there are these real factors, and you have to live within those real factors. But I sent a letter out to parents several times a year, reminding them about the difference between this class and other grading schemes that they'd be dealing with, and telling them why I'm not going to input grades every day. I'm probably going to input them once a week, maybe once every other week. Because there's nothing meaningful in terms of grades that really matters any more often than that.
What kind of grades are you putting on?
I would convert whatever it is. Yeah, that's a good question. So what happens in the interim? Well, they're accumulating grades for their journal work. Every unit, they would give themselves a grade. I probably ought to show you that too, how this journal work. This is the learning process. This is evidence of learning. And along the way, every time you do a test or some other assessment for a grade, you're racking up some information here. And every time you finish a unit, and they give themselves a grade for how well they did the process of that unit, that's another grade. And so, every couple of weeks, there'd be more information. A unit test, unit contracts. Okay, so here's how I did it. But you'll see this in this unit contracts is what I called it, structure. People in different disciplines have done wildly different things with this structure. So this is for every unit. I would have a contract that students would work on. And I would tell them everything that they're going to be assessed on, essential questions, conceptual stuff they should know, and essential skills. You should be able to use these equations, and a calendar that gives due dates for all the required stuff. But then on the front, there's this whole system. And so there are bold things that everybody has to do. These are required of everybody. That's if you did just that and you're really good, you might actually have mastered it. And then a bunch of differentiated stuff, some of which is a review of something you just did, and some of which is what I called above and beyond enrichment stuff that wouldn't be tested on. But why would you be bored if you can do something interesting? And I'd give them lots of leeway about what that above and beyond was, and some blank spaces so they could come up with their own. And all kinds of different learning style stuff, some stuff with a computer, some stuff with reading, some stuff with building, whatever. And they would, as the unit progressed, they would check off the stuff they'd done. And they would evaluate, those little dashes, they would evaluate on a 1 to 5 scale. 5 is excellent. I did this incredibly well. There was a problem set. I did it on time. It was stamped, which I'll explain in a second. We talked about it. I made some corrections. I did that process really well. When they're all done, they've got a collection of whether their work was excellent or not, what stuff they did do. If they didn't do some required stuff, they have to ding themselves seriously to come up with a grade at the end. And when they're done, and by the way, there's a lot of hand-holding at the beginning of this to help them, because they don't know how to grade themselves. They don't know a lot of things about having freedom. They don't have a lot of freedom in school. They have very little power. And human beings don't do well when they don't have any power. So at the end of this, and I've got a whole structure that explains to them, here's what an A looks like, here's what a B looks like. When you're all done, they'd give themselves a grade, and I would give them a grade. And if we disagreed, we'd talk about that too. And that would lend itself to great conversations. I would always win. You know, I'm the teacher. But if there's a difference, we'd figure out why. That is what would go into the grade book and to parents, and would end up being these things. All the units that they do in the course of a quarter would be the process grade for them. No points at all. This isn't adding up points. This is, did you do an excellent job or not?
So you put in letters?
They would evaluate on a 1 to 5 scale where 5 is excellent and 3 is mediocre for the work that they did, and I'll show you how that works in a second. But this would be a letter grade, and I would convert that into some decimal thing so I could put it in the computer, you know, translate it for the machine. So yeah, there'd be a letter grade here. And let me just say that at the end of a quarter, if you have 4 or 5 of these things stretched out and with all kinds of comments and whatnot from me, and you look at that, you can see the process of what they did in the course of a quarter really clearly. It really informs both you and them about the process of learning that they're doing. Yes, sir.
Once the kids have an idea of this whole system, how often would there be a discrepancy? Where you have to see them?
Almost never. There would almost never be a discrepancy. When they get good at this and they understand that you can't game it, there's nowhere to hide. You know, they stop playing those games. I never talked about grades with my students except at the time where we had to come up with a grade for the quarter. That's the only time I would talk about grades with them. Wouldn't that be great?
So, but you said you did this after every unit, so you didn't talk through it?
If these things were the same, there's nothing to talk about. We agree that that's the kind of work you're doing.
But if they're not the same?
If they're not the same, then we have a conversation. But then it's not about grades. It's about, are you manipulating me? Do you really not understand why this isn't excellent work? Because then we should talk about what excellent work looks like. We're not talking about points, ever. There aren't any points. Imagine living without points and the tyranny of points.